I'm Shireen Poonawala, Head Business Management for Julius Baer India, and I welcome you all to Julius Baer's monthly expert talk series that we regularly have, where we invite industry thought leaders and subject matter specialists with the goal of keeping you all updated on topical subjects of interest. For our last several expert talks, we have had industry leaders and stalwarts like Nandan Nilekani, Rakesh Junjunwala, Alpesh Shah, Narayan Ramachandran as our keynote speakers. Our speaker today is Mr. Karan Datta. I don't think he needs an introduction because he's been one of our earlier speakers as well, and a very well-received session as always. He is an investor, speaker, and thinker with over 25 years of experience in the financial services industry and has held several leadership positions at Goldman Sachs, Franklin Templeton, Axis Mutual Fund, Aditya Birla Financial Services, and Tata Finance. His most recent job was as Chief Business Officer at Axis Mutual Fund. And prior to Axis, he was at Goldman Sachs Asset Management as National Sales Head. Apart from his financial career, he is a well-respected speaker on several other issues, and is regularly invited to speak on topics such as national security, cost of terrorism in India, sports, and business. So today we bring forth a discussion on an interesting topic, and I can't wait to let Karan delve more into it. So handing over the platform to you, Karan, over to you.
Namaste, and thank you very much, Shireen, for that introduction, and again for inviting me over to the JB platform. I mean, for me, Julius Baer has always been the gold standard for wealth and advisory business, and personally, it's just a matter of great honor to be present there as a speaker on a topic which I think sometimes gets overlooked in our busy schedules. You did mention that I've been part of financial services, which is true. But nowadays, I do spend a lot of time studying issues such as geopolitics, strategic affairs, India's national security, costs of terrorism. And I've kind of put these thoughts together over the last 18, 24 months. And my attempt is to kind of bring that out to the audiences at large. And at the JB platform last time, we had done the discussion on various aspects. And I just as a very quick refresher, for people who may have been there at last time, and just a quick refresher, it was at that time I'd spoken about the China-Pakistan economic corridor, and how between the Pakistanis and the Chinese there is this attempt to narrow down the logistics costs, etc., of moving oil. So instead of moving oil on the Indian Ocean, you kind of build infrastructure, etc., and CPEC at that time was discussed. But more importantly, what I had also discussed, this is like about 12 months ago, was the fact that semiconductors was going to be at the middle of new wars. And I think that's starting to play out. And I'm sure there are many industry stalwarts on this call who probably are facing some sort of shortage in their industries or in their businesses. And in that sense, this is something that we'd spoken about 14 months ago. What I intend doing today is kind of spend some time on speaking about national security and geopolitics and strategic affairs, but there's a slight change in that format. What I intend doing is also see it through another lens, which is the India lens. It's very, very important to see it through the India lens because, well, everyone on this call is Indian. We're all citizens of this nation. So if we keep discussing what's happening around the world and don't see it through the India lens, then we're kind of doing disservice to ourselves. So that being the background, that's how I wanted to do that. Just wanted to set the background. And what I'll do is get my slides on, and we'll spend some time. So it's not as if we won't discuss the core issues such as COVID and Afghanistan and Taliban. It's just that the lens that I see things through will be our lens. So with that background, give me 2 minutes. I'll just quickly start my slides and we'll get on to what I want to talk about today. So I'll dive quickly right into the slides themselves. And By the way, I've taken about 5 months to put it all together after reading, researching, listening to speakers, etc. And I was looking for a title for this particular presentation, and I just thought that I think it's important to understand that there are the coming wars and there is the India factor. So here goes the coming wars in India. Let's just look at what are the coming wars. Uh, this is the format of the new wars. It's on 9 different fronts. I mean, I have just highlighted 9. There could very well be 2 or 3 that I've overlooked or probably not put out here. But this is the format of the new wars. And I'm not going to kind of explain each one of them, but we'll just quickly, just take a bit of time and just go through each of them. There will be 2 that I discuss in detail, but this is the new format of wars. It's cyber, it's electromagnetic pulse. It's actually more about water, less about land. It's definitely economic wars and not necessarily political wars. There are trade wars. There is biological wars, which I think we're in the middle of one. There are narrative wars. It's very important. I'm going to speak about narrative. So 7 and 8 is something I've clubbed together and something I want to speak about. Narrative wars, PSYOPs, which is psychological operations. It's about what is fed to us. And finally, the semiconductors, nanochips, artificial intelligence, drone technology. But these are the 9 wars. And this is not just about this is not just about India. This is the globe. The globe's kind of meshed into this 9 formats. And I just quickly take 1 or 2 examples. For example, the trade wars. There is one massive trade war going on in the globe right now, and we don't seem to be focused on it. It's between the Australians and the Chinese. Tariff wars are going on, and the Australians are suffering because of that. Cyber wars between the Americans and the Chinese, between perhaps the Russians and the Americans. There is water wars. We've been at the center of water wars between us and the Pakistanis, between China and India, Brahmaputra, etc. So I'm just giving you a sense of the new wars. And of course, then there is a semiconductor nanochip war that the world is beginning to see. But what is important is that in all of these 9, not a single bullet has been fired. So there's a big shift globally in the way people are thinking, in the way strategists are thinking, in the way policymakers are thinking, that this is no longer necessary about kinetic battles. And the definition of kinetic battles is when you kind of use weaponry, missiles, bullets, armies, military confrontations. I'm not saying that those are not happening, but perhaps the world is now looking at these formats more than the bullet. And I'm going to, like I said, pick up 2 out of these to kind of showcase what I really meant to say. I'm going to pick 2. I'm going to pick up 6, that is biological wars, and 7, narrative wars. I'm going to show you what that means. And like I said, finally, there is the India angle to this entire conversation. So let's just look at number 6, which is biological wars. From here onwards, I might sound a little controversial, but the idea is that I don't want to sound confrontational or sensational in all of this, but after going through so much of studies and research, I think as a nation, we came under a bioweapons attack. COVID in its second wave was a clear-cut weaponized product that India was attacked with. And there are many ways to explain that, but I'll give you a few examples of why I say that. It's also important to understand why I say that, because otherwise it can just be a statement without any basis. So let me explain why I said that. Let's just look at March of 2021, like barely 6 months ago. So you got to now step back and look at March of 21, and then look at April of 21. Just a 35-day, 40-day gap between March and April. In March, if you look at the headlines, all the headlines was India is a beacon of hope, stock market's all-time high, vaccine exporter, India is showing the world how to handle COVID. strictest lockdown has helped the nation, etc., etc. And please look at and please remember what happened in April of the same period, like less than 40 days. India goes from, and this is what I've written out here, it goes from 10,000 cases a day to 4 lakh cases a day. There are lockdowns imposed by each state, 10 times increase in medical oxygen. It goes from 900 metric ton to 9,000 metric ton. And suddenly from Beacon of Hope, every newspaper everywhere in the world showcases India as dying. It's breathless and funeral pyres are burning. And finally, we're shown as a failing state. And most important, something that we tend to overlook, from being a vaccine exporter, we end up becoming a vaccine importer. And this is a country, we are amongst the only 5 nations in the world that is producing vaccines. So here, that's what happened in less than 40 days. And all of this happens, and the entire shift happens from beacon to failing state. And I'm just going to show you something. Again, if you rewind and go back to March, you'll notice that the first city to be hit was Mumbai, financial capital. In April, in the city I live in, Delhi, every house had at least 2 members down with COVID. Every house. There is not a single person I know who was not hit by COVID. Bangalore got hit in May. So first the financial capital gets taken out, then Delhi gets taken out, then Bangalore gets taken out. And like I said, we become a vaccine importer. Now, that does not form the basis for me to say that this is a bioweapons attack. But what is important is that 70 countries we were exporting vaccines to, when you stop exporting vaccines to them, where do they get the vaccine from? And the answer is they have to go and plead to China. And which are these 70 nations? The ones that they're at loggerheads with. The same Philippines, the Indonesians, the Taiwanese, the Bangladeshi, Sri Lankans, etc., etc. This entire list of 70 nations to whom India was supplying suddenly has to come at the beck and call and the mercy of the Chinese to ask for vaccines. So, and by the way, I'm going to be talking about this in a little bit more detail in another section, but I just wanted to set the narrative that this was a classic case of a bioweapons attack, certainly the second wave. And remember that the Delta wave was so virulent that we are still the only country which has had the Delta wave in such virulent forms. No one's been able to explain it. Now, the last thing I want to leave everyone with on this particular point, I don't want to stretch it beyond a certain degree. Only in the last 60 days, if you look at global media, they've really gone hammer and tongs and said, perhaps this is not a natural virus and it is man-made. Perhaps, and the operating word is perhaps, only in the last 60 days. And there's a hell of a lot of media, there's a lot of research available on that. Now I'm saying, even if there's an iota of doubt that this is not natural and could be man-made, I think we are sitting on the cusp of something which is going to have some serious repercussions on the future of how people look at biological wars and weapons. So this is one example of what I think we came under attack. Like I said, I'm going to leave it here for now, but we will come back to this format and see what India really did to kind of respond to this attack. The second piece that I want to talk about in the formats of new wars is, I said that we'll pick up 2. One is, of course, the bioweapons format. The second one I want to talk about is psychological wars, psychological and narrative wars. Now, this is very interesting because it affects you and me daily. Psyops and narratives are built around us for us to have a certain way of thinking. And I'm going to give you some examples which will kind of highlight what I'm trying to say. But I just want you to first visualize this 4 nations of 4 pieces of discussions together. There's Afghanistan, there's Taliban, there's Pakistan, China. Now, typically, when you put the 4 together, the impression one would get, oh God, what an awful list. It doesn't make sense that this list doesn't make. But this is exactly what is going on. If you look at what is happening right now, the Talibanis, the Pakistanis, and the Chinese are together. But what you really see is Joe Biden leaves Afghanistan in crisis, US leaves Afghanistan in chaos, Afghanistan Exit raises questions about US reliability in the region. I'm going to show you more stuff. America's failed war, US betrayed the Afghan forces. Now, you and me are consuming this daily, okay? And actually, what I wanted to show you was there are these three formats together. There are these three thought processes together: the Talibanis, the Pakistanis, and the Chinese. I mean, ideally, shouldn't we be questioning that singular format? That how are two nations supporting UN designated terrorists? But what are we reading? Everything anti-US. I haven't come across a single article which says, "Oh, chalo, kuch to theek hua." Nothing. It's all about declining power, failed war. Biden is a weak guy. Trump signed this. There's not a single article which says that for 20 years the American homeland has been protected. By the way, and this is not, I'm not trying to make a comment on whether the decision to leave was correct or not. That's not what I'm commenting on. What I'm trying to showcase is look at the narrative you and me are fed. Certainly when two nations are siding with terror designated people. And let me add to this. But this is what you actually see when it comes to showcasing China. Look at the headings. China endorses Taliban interim government, announces aid. World needs Taliban in Afghanistan, China tells US. China is sending aid to Taliban. It's bizarre. Why would it do that? I mean, why would any sane media outlet or anyone in their senses kind of portray the Americans as villains and the Chinese as heroes? It doesn't make sense. Till you realize that there is a war going on, which is to control what we read, to control how we behave, and then to control the narrative. We are in the middle of those wars. And by the way, it's not as if India is not affected. So this is just a very quick, 2-3 points on the PSYOPs wars. So country which has fought terrorism for 20 years, not faced a single attack on its soil, is being called a destroyer, power in decline, military loss. I mean, there's so many words. And a superpower like China, like supposed superpower, is being hailed for providing aid to Taliban, etc. And by the way, I'm not sure if you all are aware, but there's a $15 billion annual media campaign which kind of supports the China narrative. I try my best to kind of not quote out of the blue, but these are all verifiable. This is all verifiable data. I mean, this is all available, and so I've put this together after verifying it. It's a media. I mean, it's just a $15 billion annual spend to create the Chinese narrative. So I think this whole piece of what we think, what we are taught, what we are told to think about, etc., needs to that, which is why it's very, very important to look beyond the obvious. If it is so obvious, there's something wrong. And so now, given this format and like kind of two examples, what I've shared, like right at the start, I mentioned that I want to give it the lens of an Indian. What are you and me going to do about it? How do we take care of ourselves? It's 9 formats. And of course, there is a military format as well. What does all this mean for India and her security? Because finally, remember, and I've said this in my previous presentations also, that we've been independent 70 odd years. It's been 800 years of the Mughal Empire and then 400 years of the British Empire. I mean, almost 1,000 years of not having had our freedom. So all of this is sacrosanct for our existence. The stock markets are important, but your personal freedom is perhaps much more important. And so I'm like I said, I'm going to just look at it from an India point of view and what it means for her security and what is India doing about it. So here is what I have been picking up over the last few years. And I must say this, I must make this very candid and very clear. What I'm trying to portray right now is not a political thought process. It's what I'm picking up. It's things that, okay, there's a methodology to this entire aspect. It's pieces that are being written about, and then there is follow-up action to it. So this is not about a comment on the political policy making. This is about India's policy making between its bureaucrats, between the bureaucrats, between the security teams, between people who run this nation. And so in parts, if you think that this is a political message, that won't be fair. And I think what I've tried to do is look at, I mean, this has come after seeing action on various fronts after over 6 or 7 years. So these are the three pieces that in my opinion have really, this is where the changes are taking place. And I'm going to spend some time on all three, but let's just start with the first one, strategic alignment versus non-alignment. I think this is one of the biggest changes that have happened in India, because from being a non-aligned nation, we've started taking alignment decisions. Now, very important to remember that it's not as if we're choosing one nation over the other. No, but there are decisions that we're taking which are important for us to set direction correct. That we will take care of our interests first. And let me give you some examples, and once we're done with the examples, and you'll get an idea of what I'm trying to say. So let me just start with some of these examples. Look at the Quad. The Quad is quadrilateral, and it is a coming together of four nations today to form a kind of a security blanket in the Indian Ocean region. Now, that's India, there's Japan, the United States, and Australia. Now, four massively important, large, militarily strong nations have come together to take care of interests in the Indian Ocean region and perhaps also in the South China Sea. Now, it's not just about military coming together. Let me show you a slide which, again, I'm not going to go into details, but it'll give you an idea of what all is in the Quad. There's also about vaccines, there's also about transfer of technology, there is also work around Maitri, then there is military coming together. And the Quad was not an idea that came up in 2014. No, it was an idea that actually got conceptualized in 2007. Almost 15 years ago is when it was conceptualized. But the operationalization of that happened in 2014, 15. And by the way, it's really caught steam 2018. And now on 24th September, Prime Minister of India is now going to go to America, and the four countries are coming together for the first time in a face-to-face meet. Now, Quad is like the first steps towards a security system in the region. It is not like a NATO structure, but it is a security apparatus. We'll do many other things. It's for the first time India is starting to take those steps. Let me give you another example. Part of Quad is Malabar. Malabar is a massive maritime exercise. It's perhaps one of the biggest military war games and just a military exercise between these four nations. It's just finished last year. I'm going to give you another example of what strategic alignment means. And remember, we're not asking for boots on the ground. We're not saying that, oh, you know what, we can't take care of our security, so please come and help us out. No, that's not what we're saying. Strategic alignment is all about India's interests and who to partner with versus the non-aligned movement. And so let's take another example. These three agreements, and I'll very briefly touch upon them in the next slide, LEMUA, COMCASA, and BECA. They were signed literally 30 days before Trump vacated office. And what is really fascinating is that the Republicans and the Democrats never see eye to eye on anything. The only thing that the two aisles see eye to eye on is the fact that they need to kind of have India on their side right now. So LEMUA, COMCASA, and BECA were signed just when Trump knew he's leaving, and this was signed. And obviously, it has both sides, like I said, of the aisles agreeing to it. What are these agreements? All of them are different formats, but I just want to quickly touch on one or two pieces. For example, BECA. Look at what BECA reads. Just read it out, and you'll know what BECA really can do for India. It gets India real-time access to satellite intelligence that helps you pinpoint weapon systems, drones, and missiles. Now, it is about using satellites that the Americans have launched over decades. That's what BECA does to you. So by signing an agreement, you actually get access that for in a country like India would have taken decades to build and perhaps billions of dollars to create. You get COMCASA. COMCASA is about getting different weapon platforms, for example, different aircrafts, but you can have communications between them and Russian-built aircrafts. So the point I don't want to deliberate too much into each agreement. It's about aligning your interests to take care of your needs. These are things that we're starting to see for the first time. Like I said, Quad is not a new idea. It was always there, got operationalized. These agreements always were available, got operationalized. Let me show you something else. It's not just about the United States. I'm sure you all have picked this up in the media. These are some of the most advanced air defense systems. It's called the S-400s, and they're Russian built. They are most in demand right now. The Chinese have this system. The Chinese, by the way, buy all their defense equipment from the Russians, and then they reverse engineer it, which is one way of cyber theft. So this S-400, the orders are placed next year. India gets its first batch of S-400s. Now, please remember, if you've been following up on this whole S-400 series, it's really complicated because any country that buys S-400s will get sanctioned by the US as per US, as per US laws. But they've taken a waiver for India. So the Americans have given a waiver that India can buy the S-400. They've given a verbal waiver. But even if the sanction was going to come through, India was not going to stop its agreements in buying this kind of technology from the Russians. Let me show you something else. Israeli drones for surveillance along the LOC. Okay, there's tons and tons of stuff happening on intelligence with the Israelis. So much so that things that were so much we were talking so much about an issue till about a month ago. That was Pegasus. Pegasus was an Israeli company. I'm not trying to say that the government had Pegasus on board. No, we didn't need Pegasus on board because remember, there's Becca, there's Comcasa, so you kind of get access to intelligence anyway. But I'm just trying to showcase that India is kind of maneuvering its way, getting into agreements with the Russians, with the Israelis, with the Americans, and the Iranians. Remember, Iran's got sanctions on it. But the foreign minister, and in this particular photograph, you can see that the Iranians and the Indians are coming together, and we're buying Iranian oil, even though they have US sanctions. Not just that, you actually had Prime Minister of India getting these highest civilian awards. And so I'm just trying to put this whole thing together to kind of showcase that even with some of the toughest partners in the Middle East or with the Saudi Arabians, the entire foreign policy machinery is working. And you can see that while India is aligning with countries, it's not trying to kind of leave anyone behind. So based on its interests, it's signing agreements, doing things, and is keeping everyone in the loop. Very different from being non-aligned. I want to show you one last slide on this front, which is, like I said, I'll come back to vaccine diplomacy. Till we got hit by this second wave, which like I said, in my opinion, was a direct bioweapons attack. Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Japan, Malaysia, 71 countries, doses after doses. The only country that was kind of doing vaccine diplomacy was India. And so what does all this mean? It just gives you an idea that as we speak today, India has just assumed the presidency of the United Nations Security Council for at least about 18 months. See what is happening with Pakistan on FATF. FATF is the Action Task Force on Counterterrorism. Pakistan continues to remain on the grey list for another year. And apart from strategic alignments, very important to showcase what are the agreements that we've not signed, which is actually of the Chinese. We've not signed the RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic. We've not signed the RCEP. We've not joined the BRI. So it's not just about the agreements that we're signing. It's also about the agreements that we're not signing. And for example, like I said, we've not signed RCEP, we've not signed BRI. This really irked the Chinese to a pretty large extent. But what is really important also to remember is that India is not signing agreements with just one country. For me, I think that's the biggest change that has happened. And it's just a process that has got into action now. Let's see what happens in times to come. So this is the first section, which is strategic alignment versus non-alignment. I want to get into the next one, which is defensive offense versus offensive defense. It's not a play of words. Don't go by the play of words. As a nation, and this I can go on and on talking about. We've always been we've always been defensive, and in a way we've said that that's our go-to mechanism. So for example, I'll give you an example. As a nation, when the parliament attack happened in 2001, the entire army got activated. I mean, we had Operation Brass Tacks at that time. We were on the verge of war. Remember 2001, the parliament attack is like, if it had gone off successfully, you would have had the lawmakers of India. I mean, they would have all probably died, the lawmakers. But we didn't do anything at that time. We kind of made the moves, didn't do anything. Look at what happened in Kandahar, ICA 184. Look at 2611. You look at Bombay train attacks. It's just a series of things where we projected our defensive approach as a form of being offense, as a form of our offense. Now, uh, but the Indian policy making has shifted this thought process to something that now they call, it's in policy records and has been spoken about. It's called offensive defense. This whole shift is now called offensive defense, and it's very different from defensive offense. Like I said, it's not a play of words. I will prove it to you what I'm trying to say. Offensive defense means that if I perceive a threat ahead of time as a nation, if we perceive a threat ahead of time, we will take action against it. Or if we have been attacked, we will take action against it. Or if we think we will be attacked, we will take action. Very, very different from I will think about it. My form of retaliation is no attack. It's very different. Let me give you some examples, and you'll probably get to understand what I'm trying to say. Just give me let's just go through some examples of offensive defense. Before I get into the examples, it's very important to remember one thing, that the if you look at the if you look at the thought process of policymakers in India over decades, you'll recognize that as a nation, we've not been an expansionist nation, thereby meaning that we don't go and acquire lands. We've probably lost lands. We've lost Aksai Chain, we've lost POK. Of course, but we've never gone and said, okay, today we go and we have aimed to take XYZ. Tomorrow we'll take Tibet. Day after tomorrow we'll go into Sri Lanka. Bhutan is ours. We've never done. So what I'm trying to say is that when you're not in that form, in that thought process, you're building for uh, an establishment which takes care of its defense. But the minute the thought process changes, not being expansionist, but being protectionist, the whole purpose is to look at defense, but from an offense lens. Let me explain what I meant. Look at every year from 2014, and again, I'm just at the cost of repeating myself. This is not a statement on politics out here. This is factual stuff I'm putting in front of you. No one can deny this. In 2015, even before Uri happened, even before Balakot, none of this had happened. Right in 2015, perhaps you all will remember, the Indian army came under an ambush, and we lost soldiers. Right then, within a month, uh, Indian troops, special forces, crossed into Myanmar to attack rebel bases. This is the first time ever that India had crossed the border lines of any other country, 2015. And around the same time, around the 2014 time, is when there was so much discussion around India's security apparatus, terrorism, etc., and the narrative has started to build that we will take action. 2015, action. 2016, Uri happened. And then you had India cross into POK for surgical strikes. 2017, Doklam happened. Doklam was the third country. It was Bhutan that was bearing the brunt of the Chinese, coming down onto them. 2017, Doklam pushback happened. 2019, Balakot happened as a result of the Pulwama massacre in which 35 Indian soldiers died. 2019, Balakot happened. 2020, Galwan happened, which is just now, like literally June of last year, where we lost 20 soldiers. And now intelligence reports suggest that the Chinese probably lost upwards of 60 soldiers on that one night. Now, if you look at the format out here, I'm not trying to, kind of, it's not about, it's not about, it's not a war cry out here that I'm trying to build out here. It's about a methodology of supporting what you say. So, as a nation, if you're going to come under attack and are not going to take action versus you come under attack but take action, so you're building a new narrative, like I said, that is now beginning to get inculcated in the thought process of the policymakers, which is offensive defensive. If you hit me, I will hit you back. If I think you're going to hit me, I'll hit you first. And for that, you need a brand new set of not just thought process, but a brand new mechanism of dealing with this thought process. And I think that's starting to happen in our nation. For example, INS Vikrant, India's first aircraft carrier, maiden sea trials, BrahMos missiles, and I can just the list is really really long. This is really sophisticated weaponry. BrahMos, I mean, I can spend an hour talking about it, but really sophisticated weaponry. Uh, I'm not sure if people on this call are aware, but we are amongst the five nations in the world which are which is known as the nuclear triad, which basically means you are nuclear capable on land, air, and sea. Very few countries in the world have that capacity. BrahMos kind of extends that capacity. Rafales. This has generated so much controversy for all the wrong reasons, but super sophisticated aircraft. 36 of them will get inducted. In fact, 18 of them are already in here, and they're getting modified for Indian conditions. So much happening on weapon systems. For the first time ever, the Indian Navy has plans to procure 24 submarines, nuclear submarines, attack submarines, etc. And the list is long. Uh, but what I wanted to showcase also is this is not the only place where offensive defense is in play. Look at the way we've tackled COVID. Remember in my initial slide, I mentioned that we came under a bioweapons attack. Now you lost that battle. India lost that battle to begin with because it was carnage, house after house, person after person. It's now 4 months since then. April has finished. Uh, May, June, July, August. We are 4 months into that phase. It's very fresh in our memories. Just yesterday or day before yesterday, we crossed the 75 crore mark on doses. Uh, Oxygen supply is now up to, it's gone up 10 times it went up 10 times in less than 40 days. We're still amongst the only 5 countries which is creating vaccines. 75 crore is 1 crore a day is 2 countries literally a day. And perhaps at this rate, by December, you might just have a population which probably is now half vaccinated. Now, if you look at an equivalent Europe, you notice that that's not the case happening in EU, or for that matter, anywhere in the West, because that the scope at which this is all taking place is much slower. Um, it's not to showcase that we that the way we've come out of COVID. I'm not trying to say that we're out of COVID. I'm just trying to say that how we're tackling things with that offensive mindset. You'd be surprised that if you look at the last line that I've written out here, ROK Setu is now being recognized world over, and people want APIs to that kind of app so that they can use it in their own countries. It's just a thought process that you do not remain defensive, you actually become offensive while tackling issues. So I think the summary of this second tectonic shift is India is now handling 2.5 fronts. We've always war game for that. We're looking at China, Pakistan, and Kashmir insurgency, all three simultaneously. It's actually 2.5 fronts. It's nothing new. It's not as if it's happened only in the last 7 years. Not at all. We've always planned for it, but now you're actually seeing year after year, you're actually seeing action being taken on it. There is also the intent for power projection in the region, and for that purpose, you're starting to see India's naval power projection in the region. And I think to some extent, India is not backing out from taking tough decisions, good or bad. Not getting into the quality of the decision, but I think the decision making is starting to happen, and some tough decisions have been taken. So this is the second part I want to talk about. Like I said, first one was non-alignment to strategic alignment. Second one is defensive offense, and we shifted to offensive defense. And the third is something that I call as, I think for now, what we're starting to see in this nation, and perhaps we'll see much more of it in the decades to come, is the fact that it's about India first rather than politics first. Now, it's still very early days on this one, but there are some signs of it starting to happen. And remember, please remember, if we don't get all this right, you and me are under the severity of those 9 new formats of warfare. So if these three things don't really come together, we're in trouble anyway. So, but there are these first linkages of how politicians, I mean, I'm now not saying one or the other, I'm just saying I think politicians are also probably realizing that's about India's interests first, and then perhaps politics for later. Let me give you some examples. um, I think in the last 6 years, 7 years, we've had 65 strategic roads that have got constructed in some of the most inhospitable. There's just territories that are literally you cannot go through. Tunneling, whether it's tunnels, whether it's weather conditions, whether it's cutting through the hills. But 65 strategic roads have been built in the last 6, 7 years. Again, just to reiterate, not as if these roads were not being constructed earlier. It's just that all of them they've all been speeded up. The process has got faster. There's closure on all of this. And so this has happened. Uh, just as something that affects you and me on a daily basis. 37 kilometers per day of highway construction. That rate was 16 and a half kilometers. It's just flipped over and doubled. Um, I'm sure there are some people on this call who probably have been touched by in some form or the other what's happening on the unicorn side as when it comes to the digital infrastructure in India. And it's just so many names. And just as an illustration, I got these 7, 8 names to show that a friend of mine, by the way, is a fintech entrepreneur, and we were having coffee the other day, and he told me something that really kind of has stayed with me. According to him, by 2030, India would probably have 1,000 unicorns, digital unicorns, 1,000. That by far will surpass any number anywhere in the world. And that's not too far out. That's like in 9 years, according to him, at least 1,000 unicorns. What else? We're beginning to see things like toilets and Swachh Bharat and open defecation coming down, districts where open defecation has. So, for us on this call, this sounds as if, okay, no big deal, but its ramifications on the economy are very large. For example, you stop spending too much money on, you just have lesser deaths, the children kind of live in better conditions, etc. But these are steps starting to show some results. I'm not for a minute saying that they've all been done, starting to show some results. You I think the digital world starting to take advantage of the Jan Dhan Aadhaar mobile, the JAM connections. You got, so whether it's the coming together of bank accounts or gas connections or electricity and Bima and Yojana, etc., the whole ecosystem starting to come together. Again, this is not about kind of saying that wow, everything is perfect. Clearly not. It's a coming together of making sure India stands out first, and then the politics comes later. It's a series of those steps. And finally, I think in this section of India first, what I've noticed is that I think national security, economic security is starting to emerge as something which is more important than just winning elections. Of course, winning elections is paramount, but it's starting to emerge as something which is slightly more important. And there is an attempt being made to improve the lives of citizens, and in some ways reflected in the international standing of where this nation heads now. So those are the three pieces, and those are the three broad pieces where I wanted to share my ideas, whether it is, like I said, alignments, offensive defense, India first. And the last piece I want to leave all of you is, I know there's this tremendous talk around Taliban, Afghanistan, China, and all of that, and we can discuss that over Q&A. But I want to leave you with some thoughts around our neighbor, China, because this is one country which seems to be in the middle of all conversations these days. So if I ask friends, which is Which is the powerful nation? The answer is China. Which is a successful country? The answer is China. And of course, there's no doubt that they've done some remarkable things. But the other day, I was listening to commentary on China's trains, and everyone knows that they've nailed it when it comes to trains and super speed trains and the maglev, which is at 600 kilometers an hour, and that they've got this entire network of trains crisscrossing the nation. No one competes with them when it comes to train networks. But what was surprising, and I think a lot of people maybe on this call may not be aware, is uh, that their entire infrastructure on air travel completely sucks. Actually, what that program suggested, and then I studied a little bit about it, is that the average waiting time for taking a flight, the delay time, average delay time is 6 hours. So it's very natural that something like trains has got recreated because the air travel in China really, really is troublesome. And the reason for that is very simple, that virtually every airport is under military command. So till the air traffic controls don't get approvals from the military traffic controllers, they cannot let an aircraft fly. That's basically meant 5 hours of delay time. Imagine you going to take a flight and average delay is 5 hours. Clearly, you will look for substitutes. So what you hear is maglev, but what you don't hear is the 5 hour delay. And I'm just going to show you that if you are a global citizen, any part in the world, not just in India, if you're sitting anywhere in the world, actually, this is what you're beginning to see. Let me show you some stuff. This is what you're beginning to see. You have Wang Yi in the middle out here, the foreign minister, the perhaps the most powerful person after Xi Jinping. Um, and he's standing with this delegation of Talibanis. Like everyone clearly knows that nine of them perhaps UN designated terrorists. So if you're a global citizen, you see this photograph, and you start to wonder, why would a superpower stand along terrorists, right? I mean, it's just a very natural question. Um, you actually start seeing media reports that this is a Chinese virus. It perhaps is man-made, perhaps leaked, perhaps weaponized. Tons and tons of reports coming on that front. So if you are an Indian, if you're a global citizen, you start to see this. You start to read BRI. I've read tons. I mean, my friends have sent me some great stuff on BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. This is just a caricatured format because I want to keep it simple. BRI is making sure that countries that sign up on Belt and Road Initiative and they're poor countries, they have to give up their lands. They have to give up the roads in favor of the Chinese. So the BRI is a debt trap. The Chinese debt trap. Literally yesterday, Evergrande, which is China's largest real estate developer, has gone bust. It's kind of almost 3% of China's real estate. They've gone bust. They're not paying their interest. This happened yesterday. No one's talking about it. So not just the BRI debt trap, there is a Chinese debt trap beginning to happen. Hackers, they attacked India's power grid. They've attacked Australian banks. They probably keep attacking the National Stock Exchange. So if you're a global citizen, if you're in India or if you're in the US or if you're a European, these are the photographs that you end up seeing. You actually then read that the Chinese have been hacking American companies and they've been reverse engineering defense equipment, which is why finally Huawei got banned, which is why finally ZTE got banned, which is why the semiconductor industry out there is starting to really, really struggle because there's a ban on them. And finally, I mean, this happened about 2 months ago, that the European Union has suspended trade deals with the Chinese. This has never happened. 7 years it took them to sign this deal and it's been rescinded. I'm sure all of you are aware of this. As last reports, $2 trillion of market cap has been eroded because the Chinese have gone and attacked their tech firms, Didi and Tencent. And I'm not getting into the reasons why. It's $2 trillion in 40 days. Yesterday, I was reading reports that the numbers coming in from China's economic indicators not looking good. And finally, this one slide, which is where I leave it. If you look at the population, it's called the Tengchong line, Hai-He Tengchong line, 94% of China's population lives on the east or the right-hand side of this imaginary line. Only 6% lives on 60% of the land. What the Chinese are trying to do is make the 6 also look like the 94. And hence there is no intent out there to keep the identity of the minorities intact. So whether it's the Tibetans, whether it's the Uyghurs, whether it is the province of Xinjiang, it's just they want everyone to look like the 94%. And finally, this slide on the right-hand side, if you look at China, it's a combination of 5 nations actually, because it's been an expansionist army. Turkestan, Tibet, they've taken Manchuria, they've got Hong Kong, and now they want Taiwan. So if you look at all of this, what it really means that there are fault lines. Please don't take everything on the face of it. There are fault lines that exist in the neighborhood. We need to really, see beyond and actually not just fall for the narrative, because the narratives have a $15 billion spend backing up trying to build that in our heads. There perhaps is an existential crisis, like I said, the semiconductors, 5G, and now if Taliban joins that list, you're actually talking about an existential crisis. And these things don't happen overnight. They may take decades, but the paths then get set. Finally, I just want to kind of summarize by saying we're at the new frontiers of war as a nation. India is beginning to see tectonic shifts, trying to address some of those new formats. And the world will come together to tackle these over the next 20 years. It's very, very important to remember that these are decadal decisions. They are not about the next year. I'll tell you why. Because it's not about tackling Pakistan. It is about projecting power in the region. It is about projecting power in the Indian Ocean region. It's about projecting power in the South China Sea. It's about projecting economic power. So it's not about just 1 or 2 nations here and there. And I think all of this starting to come together, perhaps over the next 15 years, I would think that if the steps are taken, you could probably see the emergence of a superpower called India. Thank you, and I'll leave it there. And I once again really apologize for the slip-ups on, I'll blame it on the Wi-Fi for today. I'm going to stop here and happy to take any questions. Thanks for listening to me.
Thank you, Karan, for this very, very interesting session. And yeah, I think the Chinese had some intelligence and tried to hack the session in between. So we will just wait for the questions to come in, but I think there are already some in the queue. So do you want to take the first one?
Sure, I'm just, yeah, I'll take the first one. First of all, Raja, thanks a lot for being kind to me. Amazing session. Thanks in spite of the glitches. And again, like Shireen was very nice about it. She's blaming the Chinese hackers. On the question raised by Vandan Shah, is there primary evidence that the second wave was a biological warfare coming from the fact that other nations went to China? It's not just about that other nations went to China for vaccine. It is about, just think about this, Vandan. I'm not sure which part of the country you're in. Let's assume you're from Bombay. How does somebody go from 10,000 to 4 lakh cases in less than 30 days? How does your requirement go from 900 to 9,000 metric tons in less than 30 days? How do you become an example of sorting COVID out in the first wave after you've taken the toughest decision to kind of control and not no one stepped out? GDP was kind of negative. How do you go from there to becoming as if India is a failed nation? If you look at the narrative, if you look at the intent of the narrative was to show India as a deeply failed state. And I think that's really, really the key out here. It was that fact that you wanted to show India as a failed nation at the top of its game when it came to controlling COVID. That's the real issue out here. I'll take this question, Shireen, from Snehal, where she says that what are the gravest and most imminent risks India faces, and where are the gravest, most imminent, toughest, and perhaps the starkest risks India faces is from terrorism. There is absolutely no doubt about it. I've spoken at length on this. And because JB will understand, and there are people who will understand the world of compounding out here. We lose 1.5% GDP on every large attack and 2% investment growth on every large attack. Every large attack, we lose 2% investment, 1.5% GDP, and we've had 6,024 attacks in the last 20 years, up until 2014. 6,000 attacks. I'm assuming there's one large attack a year. Compounded, we lost half an economy in the last 20 years. That's how big the risk is. And I think, please remember, again, a stat that you can verify. We've not had in the last 7 years. A civilian terror attack.
Okay, there's one question on what is the view on oil and, more importantly, oil dependence given the geopolitics.
So the question on oil is, so let me answer that slightly. Okay. Is my Wi-Fi stable right now, Shireen? Is it okay?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay. Okay. On oil, it's our biggest bill. It's 85% of our requirements are imported. And which is why, if you look at the intent of this government, perhaps is to go towards new forms of energy. So this whole, today, I think they've just announced the PLI on automobile, etc., for clean energy, renewable energy. I just think that we may not be battery and lithium producers, but perhaps India will become the largest country when it comes to usage of electric vehicles over the next decade. And so you'd probably see energy dependence of a different format altogether, where you just don't rely on oil, and it's 85% of our import bill, and we're forever at the mercy of providers. That's one. Second, I think it'll also be about securing oil sources, which is why these agreements with Iranians at one side and with the Americans now, with the Americans as well, as far as oil security is concerned. So it's a combination of various factors put together.
Okay, the next question is, Amit Vaidya has again appreciated your session. And obviously it is true that, it is a very difficult and complicated topic, but you made it quite easy for us to understand and look beyond the obvious. His question is, should India focus on Chinese debt-trapped countries, and how?
Actually, it's already beginning to happen, and certainly in our neighborhood, because this I can answer in another format. That if you look at what's happening between us and the neighborhood, whether it's now Nepal, Bhutan, actually even going back to Sri Lanka, what's happening with us in Mauritius, what's happening between India and Seychelles, us and the Iranians, you're beginning to see India starting to have these agreements, trade agreements, with a variety of nations in the periphery and outside its periphery, to do exactly what this question was asking about: signing agreements on A, security, B, trade, that we're beginning to see already.
The next question is from Snehal Parekh. What are the chances that Pakistan will actually be declared a terrorist state?
So Snehal, it really doesn't matter whether they're declared one or not, because in the eyes of the public, that's already happened. And especially if you gloat over things like, standing with Taliban, acting as if you really won the war, whereas this is just the start of all the pain in that own country. So in the eyes of the world, it's already a terrorist state. In fact, it's an irrelevant, inconsequential nation for which we've just wasted 70 years of our time kind of focused on them. Shireen, I'll take this question from Akshay. It's a really good question. Can I just quickly read it out?
Sure.
It looks like a very interesting question. China gave up a lot in terms of freedom and democracy for 30 to 40 years of supernormal growth. Is that the only path ahead? Or what else can it do to grow at 8 to 9%? Actually, I wanted to share with everyone out here, there is something very interesting happening in China. The demographics of that nation is changing very sharply because of the one child policy. By the end of 2060, uh, they probably, in another 50 years from now, the Chinese population will probably be down to 800 million people. They're currently at 1.5 billion. They'll be down to 800 million. And in another 80 years from now, they will have the highest number of, they'll have 300 million people who are pensioners. That is so large that no way that any economy can support it. So there's a huge shift beginning to happen, which is why the costs of producing goods out there are beginning to go up. And in that sense, the Chinese are aware of it and they're trying to make changes, but that directional trajectory is set. And I think it's something that we tend to overlook very often, that it's just not only have they given up freedom and democracy, they've actually given up future growth because it will have 300 million pensioners in not too far out a period. Um, our path on this one is not to copy the Chinese model. And which is why it's very, very important to stick to the India model, which is about the three pieces which I spoke about. And I think in many ways, you're starting to see the first steps being taken. We are a consuming economy. Our entire build out on the economy is predicated on the fact that we are a young nation which will consume. And I think that in itself is very, very powerful. It's something completely different from the Chinese model, which is all about exports. So the two won't see eye to eye. I also don't believe that India will be able to challenge China on the manufacturing front. We will challenge them on the digital front. That's where the big difference will start to take place.
So, Karan, there was one question which even I had in my mind was why would the US leave Afghanistan and let Taliban and China take over? What is in it for US here? Why couldn't they have continued the way they were?
Think of it another way, Shireen. They've been there 20 years. They spent $3 trillion on two wars. They've lost over 5,000 soldiers in Afghanistan. They finally managed to get Osama as far as 10 years ago. The entire backbone is broken. They've not had a single terror attack on their nation. They don't consider themselves as the global police force right now. They don't think that they need to act like that. There is no reason for them to be there. I mean, look at it another way, right? So every nation has to build its own. Finally, every nation is responsible for its own build out. There's a Pew research that came out, and it asked Afghanistan's citizens, Afghanis, are you happy about Americans leaving? Are you happy about Talibanis coming in? You'll be shocked to see the results. 90% of the Afghanis were in favor of the Taliban government coming in because finally that's what they want. It's the last 5% that we hear that is very upset, very angry, because it's a population of 38 million people. Out of those 38 million people, 2 million probably worked with the NATO forces, worked with the Americans. But 35 million of them, for them, Kabul is not Afghanistan. So the provincial governors, the provincial leaders, they sense that perhaps we need to find out our own way. And then they think that Taliban is also, Shireen, that's not the end story right now. There's just so many factions that are out there. Why would any nation want to just, I, I'm not saying that the decision is correct or anything. I'm just saying that they've overspent their time there anyway. So the real question to ask is what does that do to India? And I must say this out here that India was the only country that was not putting political powers out there. Like, where is the last time you heard India trying to prop up a politician in Afghanistan? When do you associate Ashraf Ghani or anyone else being a puppet of the Indians? What were the Indians doing? We spent $3 billion on roads, dams, projects, parliament house, etc. If you really ask the Afghani people, they kind of respect India for what we've built out there. And they're happy that we didn't get involved in their political discussions. And they're happy in some ways that they've got a government that is from their own kind of from their own diaspora. And I really don't think that the Americans made it amply clear 2 years ago that they're leaving.
Yeah, so there was this, you already answered that question of Harsh. He had a question saying, does the emergence of Taliban mean more issues in Kashmir?
No. I'm a firm believer of okay, what was the headline today? If you please open today's paper and see what's the headline today. And the first headline that hits you is terror module busted. Right, Shireen? I don't know if you saw that. 6 people got arrested between Delhi, Bombay, and Uttar Pradesh. They had RDX, IED. It doesn't matter what happens with the Talibanis, what happens in Pakistan, what does China up to. If you don't have a safe and secure nation, you will be attacked. And hence your ability to gather intelligence, listen into the intelligence, act on the intelligence, and take protective measures. I don't think we are in a zone where we are going to get where it can get tougher than the 90s. The 90s were tough. 90s were tough, where we have 6,500 infiltrations and day after day you had attacks in Kashmir. We are a far more secure and safer nation. And today is a great example of that. And today is not the only example. There are many terror modules that are beginning to get busted, and partly perhaps because of the intelligence sharing that we're getting from the Israelis and Americans.
I think we've already extended way beyond our time limit, but we'll take the last couple of questions. So there's one question which says, with all the talk on China and the shifting sands in relation to India gaining an advantage in business, do you see India gearing up or shaping enough to build up infrastructure, etc., for making more business come to us?
I think it's not going to be that easy for manufacturing to shift to India. It will always be China. Now, so the whole discussion is China plus one. So the bigger beneficiaries have been countries like Vietnam, etc., or Bangladesh for that matter. I'm not a believer that we will get massive benefits because of people wanting to have alternate sources of supply chains. I don't think we're there yet. But I really do think that other nations will benefit. But the benefit India gets is support for its digital infrastructure and its ability to provide jobs. And I think that's where we really need the money, because remember, we're not the best football manufacturers. We don't want to be garment manufacturers, but you want to do high-end manufacturing. So one of the things that the government is focused is on high-end defense manufacturing, high-end aerospace, high-end usage of finally electric cars. Now, I think that's where the shift is. And I think that's where we are headed. So we probably transcend one whole manufacturing generation and go to this newer way of using our technologies. I think I'll take this one question from Vinod, which is really important. What is China and Afghanistan for? What are they there? Are they there for the mineral deposits, or what are they there for? They're actually there for copper in that sense. You'll actually now start seeing copper prices. There will be the requirement for copper that goes up quite substantially. And in some sense, they're there for the copper. But more importantly, why are the Chinese with the North Koreans? Why are the Chinese with the Pakistanis? Why are the Chinese forever with all the wrong names? It's a question that we've got to start asking ourselves. And I think the results are that they just, currently it's a system where they think that they're occupying gaps, and the kind of moving pieces, they think that they're trying to move pieces, etc. But it's not as easy as it seems. They're not direct access to BRI, CPEC, etc. is not the only reason there. There is some form of mineral deposits, copper, like I said, but I think it's more to fill gaps in their heads than anything else.
Is there time for one more question?
Yeah, sure.
Is Afghanistan a play to boost defense equipment sales primarily? which country do you think will score?
Afghanistan is not the reason. We've been at it for some time now. I think by the way, there's this report that just came out yesterday, that India has surpassed Russia when it comes to defense spending. So we're in the top 3 already. But more importantly, this will spur defense manufacturing. For example, we just gave an order for some 59 transport vehicles that the Tatas are going to make with Boeing. Now, on the face of it, it's a $3 billion order, but look at the possibilities of employment that it could generate. I'd shown you the construction of 24 submarines, etc., and the Vikrant. Now, all of these equipment also have employment capacities, capabilities, and because there are hundreds of companies that supply such small components, so the supply chain out there is supposed to create employment, etc. And I think that Afghanistan is not the reason that we're doing this. We're doing it primarily to make sure that you're in offensive defense mode, that if someone's trying to hit you, you hit back harder before time.
I think the questions is just continuing, but one last one from Mr. Ramaturai. We did not talk much about the Russians. Where do they stand?
That's a great question. Again, I think the Russians are really, really smart. Look at how they've played this. They've used, I think it's very simplistic the way I'm putting it, may not necessarily be in those ways, but they've used the Chinese to be the ploy against the Americans. So it's like China against the Americans, and they've used India against the Chinese. So in a way, in this balance of power, they've come out reasonably smart because they've been under serious sanctions from the Obama administration, etc. But in a way, they've kind of come out as a smarter lot, where they've played nations and they're still playing at it. But like I said, if you look at the relationship between the Chinese and the Russians, it's very dangerous, that relationship. I've read about it, and they've actually gone to war twice already. And in the latest document that the Chinese have released, not only do they want Taiwan back, they want Arunachal Pradesh back, but they want Russian territory back, merging into China. Yes, Vladivostok. So it's a document. It's a document where they've given the names of the Russian nation, which historically was part of China, but they want that back. So I'm just trying to leave this thought with everyone, that this play that looks so obvious has many layers. So and it's not easy to navigate through some of these waters, but I think India is doing a pretty decent job currently to have the Americans and the Russians dealing with them simultaneously. It's not an easy job.
Okay, thank you, Karan. And I think we will conclude today's session. It was a super interesting session, especially I am very much interested in these geopolitical topics. And I'm sure the audience, the participants also had a great time and useful insights into the not so obvious. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, apologize once again for the up-down on the Wi-Fi. But I'm glad that you found this interesting, and to the audience, so kind of you, and catch you all soon. Best of luck.